that all of our supporters, that all of the protesters also believe in the rule of law. We take our hats off to the vast majority of the protesters who have been organized, who have been peaceful, who have been persistent. We ask that you keep it up. The dialogue has begun to shift away from those righteous protesters and their virtuous activities, standing up for these families all over the country, to interlopers inside activities. I will say on behalf of these families, on behalf of the family of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that they are so encouraged by the amount of people who have righteously stood up for justice for their families and who have refused to relent, even in the face of governmental opposition, in the face of intimidation, even from the White House, that they said that they will continue to stand, will continue to lift their voices in a righteous demand that justice be served, not only in these cases, but that our nation never go back to a nation where men and women and children can be murdered in the streets.
Attorney,
Mr. Crump, go ahead.
Attorney Merritt, you said something I wanted to make sure that the press had opportunity to record. You said there is a bond hearing. This is somewhat news, that there's the opportunity for the people who murdered Ahmaud to be bonded out. When is that hearing?
This Thursday morning. It should be the first hearing, so 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Okay.
And before the magistrate courts of Glenn County. That bench is under an order that we interpreted as that bench had recused itself and had been transferred to another judge. However, that at least the magistrate judge, the chief magistrate judge of that district, decided that they would allow a bond hearing. Now, a bond hearing means that they will hear whether or not there's sufficient evidence to keep those men behind bars because there's sufficient probable cause that they committed the crime for which they have been accused. And if a judge determines that there is not, then they may be released, or if they determine that they don't view these men, these murder suspects, as a threat to the community, then a reasonable bond would be set. However, we don't believe that any bond would be reasonable for these three brutal murder suspects.
Just two more clarifying questions before I go back to get a few clarifying questions from Attorney Crump. You said that this particular judge you had hoped would recuse. Could you just say a little bit more about that, and will there be any action taken to try to ensure that recusal?
Well, the Glenn County bench has recused itself, and a new judge from outside of the Glenn County community has been appointed. However, for this one exceptional hearing that was granted for really reasons that is frustrating to this family, and quite frankly, frustrating to the district attorney's office, they've been granted a special hearing that very few, none to my knowledge, no other defendants in that Glenn County, in the South Georgia community, will be granted due to the COVID-19 crisis. There's been a special hearing that will be held on Thursday. We are, of course, opposed to that hearing, but we are confident that the district attorney, Joyette Holmes, and her attorneys will be successful in helping to deny that bond.
Last question for you, by way of clarification. Will you or the family members be there on Thursday for the bond hearing, or is it just too hard?
Yes. So myself, Marcus Arbery, Wanda Cooper will be present at the bond hearing. My co-counsel, Benjamin Crump, will be present in Minnesota with the Floyd family. And another attorney, our co-counsel, Chris Stewart, will also be present there as well.
Great. And back to you, Attorney Crump. I wanted to just clarify, there are now two different, for lack of a better term, autopsy reports. And on the first one seemed to be more exonerating of the officers, talking about underlying health issues, saying it wasn't really clear why the person died, maybe he just died of death. It just didn't seem to be very clear, very conclusive. But the family went and got top people to do this, and they came up with something different. Can you just very briefly for the press compare the outcome of the county coroner's report to the family's top-notch forensic report?
Certainly. The county medical examiner goes through great length to try to convince us what we see with our eyes isn't what caused his death. They suggest that there was no trauma to the trachea, even though our forensic pathologist found that there was certain bruising to the C3, C4, and C5 cervical spine, which certainly is the neck area. Also, the abrasions to his face, nose, and side, which would show that knee is pressing down, causing immense pressure, but also the fact that the knees to the back. So what they are trying to say is that the cause of death, because there was not much trauma to the trachea, that they can't conclusively say that the cause of death was from asphyxia. And so they then start coming talking about, well, looked like he could have had a heart condition, even though it's not diagnosed anywhere. Remember Eric Garner, they kept coming up with undiagnosed underlying health conditions, saying them choking him is not what killed him. Furthermore, they then make this, I guess, determination that we need to cite he had drugs in his system. I again say that is an attempt to assassinate his character after they assassinated him right down in the video. When you juxtapose that with what Dr. Biden and what Dr. Wilson said, they were very straightforward. They said, based on the science, we see that he had a lack of oxygen. You can see from the video after, I believe it was 4 minutes, 39 seconds, when he goes lifeless, when he's unconscious. And so they determined that he was more than likely dead then, but certainly the knee on his neck and the continuous pressure on his back with the knees even further exacerbated it. And so those are the two autopsies. In short, I will say this, what he needed was breath. And I want to say to the public, I know a lot has been going on across America with these riots erupting in cities all across America. The family is asking everybody to take a breath, just to take a breath for peace, take a breath for justice, take a breath to heal our country, and take a breath for George. They talk about how George often preached and prayed for peace during Ferguson, during Baltimore, during even Sacramento. His nephew was saying with Stephon Clark recently. And so if George was here, he would be asking people to peacefully protest. So this week, as we get ready to bury George and lay him in his final resting place, let's follow the example of George, America, and take a breath and try to heal our country.
Very, very well said. For the media, if you have questions, please add them to the chat. We will have both these attorneys for only 5 more minutes, so we have a very hard stop for both of them in 6 minutes. What is your take on the decision of the president to use military force to try to quell some of these protests?
Dan, if I may, I want to add one more thing before I respond to that, because I don't want to run out of time, and I want protesters to know that they have been successful, that their voices have been heard, both in Ahmaud Arbery's case and the case of George Floyd. We call for new prosecutors. We believe that we wanted the best possible prosecutors to take on those cases to ensure that they're vigorously prosecuted and to ensure a conviction. And so in Ahmaud Arbery's case, we had the very competent office of Joyette Holmes to come in and take over the case. And in Minnesota, we had the very competent office of the Attorney General, Keith Ellis, who has become involved to work with the local district attorney to take over the case.
He's taking over, Ray. He's taking over.
Okay, good. Okay, I was listening to him, but he's taking over the case in order to, but in response to your question about—
Before you move on, how important is it to you that all the officers be charged versus just the officer that is, with the knee, or the officer with the back? Do you think it should be 2 officers? Should it be all the officers? Just how important is it to you that all 4 officers be charged?
It's critical. And I'm sure Brother Lee would agree that all of these officers were complicit and showing no humanity to George Floyd. But even more than that, based on the independent autopsy by the family, we believe the officer who had his knee in his back was just as culpable for the death of George Floyd as was the officer with his knee in his neck, based on the science.
What about the fact that two of the officers allegedly are rookie officers, they've been on the force for maybe a week only? Do you think that that should be an extenuating circumstance to let them avoid being charged?
Uh, I do not, and I'll let Lisa speak for a second, but at some point, it's not even about your training. At some point, it's about humanity. You have people on the street yelling to you that, hey, you are going to kill him. He can't breathe. He's calling for his mother. He urinates on himself. I mean, at what point do you say, yes, as a human being, we're killing this man?
At the point of indictment, at the point of charging, it's a probable cause standard. Whether or not there's enough probable cause evidence, which is a very low standard, that these men committed crimes, all four of the officers. If there is, and I've begun to hear some testimony or some evidence that at least one of the officers wanted to intervene but felt intimidated because of his lack of rank. However, that is a defense that he or others may offer at the time of trial. But at the probable cause stage, where we're determining whether or not there is sufficient evidence to move forward with charges against these men, we believe that there's more than sufficient evidence to move forward with criminal charges against all four men.
I just want to run through the questions in the 2 minutes I have left with you. Has Attorney General Ellison said whether he will accept the private autopsy as a part of the case against Derek Chauvin?
Attorney General Ellison has said that he wants to look at all of the autopsies and all the science as they build their case. Yes.
And it's very important, Brother Van, and for the community that we do respond to the highest office in this land, that the office of the president. What my brother Ben Crump said a moment ago was that he's asking the nation to take a breath. And what we're asking from the highest executive office in this country and from the policing agencies, from the National Guard, is to take a breath. In fact, we are all here because law enforcement refused to do what they were trained to do, what humanity dictates that they do, which is to de-escalate. What the president called for was an escalation of force in response to very righteous demands for justice for George Floyd, for justice for Breonna Taylor, for justice for Ahmaud Arbery. He decided that he would respond to that with devastating force at a time where our nation needs an example of de-escalation. So we respond to the White House that we are demanding on behalf of these families, if you're going to speak in the name of George Floyd and talk about peace and justice, then speak about de-escalation to the law enforcement community.
Wonderful. I want to thank Attorney Crump. I know we are now at his hard stop. We appreciate you and your strong leadership and courage. Any last comment before you go? I know you had a very hard stop.
I will say this, the family has announced memorial services in Minneapolis on Thursday from 1 to 3 o'clock, and North Carolina memorial service on Saturday from 11 to 3 o'clock. And then in Houston, Texas, public viewing on that Monday from 12 to 6 p.m. And the funeral, final resting funeral for George Floyd will be in Houston at 11 a.m. And we understand Vice President Biden will be in attendance.
Thank you very much, sir. I know you have to go. Attorney Merritt, I have one last question for you as we lose Attorney Crump. Christina Cara.
My heart has been with the Taylor family. I do not want to tread on the representation, the legal representation of the family. I will say in closing with my heart stop as well, that as we ask for people not to engage in violent or abrasive protests, we are asking that you direct your energy toward effective protests directed at the power structure. If you are looking for ways to effectively protest as an attorney, as a citizen, as a concerned member anywhere in the country or in the world, you can go to grassrootslaw.org, where we will be providing specific steps for you to take from home or in the streets to ensure justice for these families. grassrootslaw.org.
Attorney Lee Merritt, I appreciate you. Attorney Benjamin Crump, who's left us now, also is greatly appreciated. We will be doing weekly updates here with these attorneys and sometimes with others, just to make sure that our community remains informed. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.